What we are watching on university campuses here and what we are seeing here, you have to fantasize about these oppressed ideals. There is an emptiness there. Liberalism gets you only so far. I want more. And so I have decided to become a Christian.
Criticism at the time you wrote your article, oh, this is a cultural conversion, a political thing. This is about civilization or war.
There is a clash. Not so much a military clash as a clash of ideas. Real struggle is a spiritual struggle. And for me, it's really as simple as the God of Islam is a God of fear. The God of Christianity, I love John Lennox's description. The relationship is one that you have, and it's a relationship based on love, and it's unconditional. These are the ideas we ought to be talking about, and we ought to be passing on to younger generations. In fact, the failure to pass it on to younger generations is criminal.
Are you an outlier here, as possibly the most famous female atheist in the world coming to faith, or are you seeing other people, other secular peers going on similar journeys? Hi, it's Justin Brierley here. Really looking forward to an evening with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. It's a conversation being chaired by James Orr, and I'm delighted to be here sort of representing the surprising rebirth element of this, because Ayaan Hirsi Ali herself captures the thesis, at least, of the surprising rebirth. She was arguably the most famous female atheist in the world, the fifth horsewoman of the new atheism, and yet just about a year and a bit ago, in November 2023, came out with this extraordinary article saying that she had become a Christian. We're going to be hearing her story. I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions around the journey she's been on. And I look forward to hearing what you make of it as well when you watch and listen to it as part of the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast and video series. Enjoy.
It's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce a writer, a former politician, an activist. In fact, I would say something of an icon for free speech, for women's rights, for rational, moderate criticism of extremism in religion and ideology. She escaped from war-torn Somalia in the late 1990s. She sought and received asylum in the Netherlands, and where she began an extraordinary rise to political office in the Netherlands, and there met with triumph and then tragedy through her friendship with the Dutch documentary maker Theo van Gogh, who was murdered in broad daylight by an Islamic extremist who threatened or intimated that she would be next. Most people, I think, would have shrunk away and disappeared into the shadows, but not her. She left for the United States and began a new career of advocacy for free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and criticism not only of Islamic extremism, but I think a moderate skepticism towards all religions. And that has developed and changed in recent years, and some of you will be aware of her public conversion to Christianity at the ARC conference, on stage at the ARC conference last year in London, followed up by a beautiful essay explaining her reasoning for doing so. And so it's a very great pleasure to have her with us. She's going to speak to us briefly, and then we're going to have a fireside chat and open things up for general discussion among the group. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a very warm welcome to Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
James, thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Can you hear me? Wonderful. I always have to ask that. I've got a soft voice and an accent. It's a terrible combination. Um, I talked to James about what to talk to you about because there is just so much that goes on today. There's a lot on the freedom of speech, on academic freedom, on national identity. There are too many subjects to choose from. And I know that the point of this evening really is not for me to pontificate at you, but for us to have a conversation. But to provoke that conversation, I thought I was going to quote an American businessman who's become a friend, and his name is Bill Ackman. Bill Ackman just sent a tweet. Let me read it to you. He says, "Dear," you fill the blank, "I am unwilling to write." He says a friend was asked to write a recommendation for his daughter who's applying to Yale. And he goes, "Dear," and I suppose it's to whom it may concern, "I'm unwilling to write a letter of recommendation in support of your daughter's application to Yale. I no longer do that. It's not that I don't believe that she's qualified. On the contrary, it's because I do. You wouldn't ask me to write a letter of recommendation for her admission to Hamas. But Yale is no different than Hamas, a cult that abides no disagreement, and a cult certain of its purpose and mission beyond reflection. Yale is potentially even more dangerous. Hamas will be defeated shortly. Yale will continue to send its graduates into positions of power for years. A recent study at Harvard found that roughly 50% of the students and professors would not discuss, quote, uncomfortable topics. An essential life skill is the ability to change your mind. She won't learn that at any Ivy League school. Their reputations are still so strong that their faculty, staff, and graduates all possess the arrogant certainty of religious fanatics. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I wish her the best in search for a better school." So that's Yale. And he says that's pretty much about almost all Ivy League schools in the United States of America. The question for us here is Cambridge that much better? And I hope that provokes you, because I was provoked by the piece written by Professor David Butterfield in The Spectator on the 26th of October 2024, titled "Decline and Fall: How University Education Became Infantilized." And then he describes what's going on here, where critical thinking is shifting away to protecting the emotions and the feelings of students. And the infantilization really takes on the position of teaching them dogmas. So the question for us tonight is Cambridge also turning into a madrasa?
Ayaan, thank you so much for that characteristically provocative opening. And there's so much to say. I know I wanted to ask you about your reactions to the events in Amsterdam over the last week, given your connections to that country and to the issues that have burst open once again in Amsterdam. But let's just start with the state of the university and Bill Ackman's provocative tweet saying he would not provide any kind of reference for somebody applying to Yale. We all know that the Ivy League universities are in a terrible state. That was shown, demonstrated really beyond argument, I think, in the Senate committee hearings of just a few months ago, or maybe about a year ago, I think, with the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Elise Stefanik, grilling three heads of Ivy League universities, Yale, was it UPenn and Harvard, I think, those three. Two of them have now stepped down. One of them hasn't, but maybe on the way out.
MIT.
MIT, that's right. And so I suppose the question is, are there reasons to be more hopeful, despite Professor Butterfield's brilliant article in The Spectator? Are there reasons to be more hopeful of the state of play here in the UK from your point of view? You've spending more time now in England. You've had time to experience life in Oxford. This is it's wonderful to have you here. What is your sense of whether there are any differences, or is it a question that the direction of travel, is it more that the direction of travel is the same? Are we heading to the same destination, but a little bit more slowly?
I want to say there is good news and there's bad news. And I think for the United Kingdom, there is the good news that the institutions here have not decayed as badly as they have in the United States. Number one. Number two, again, the good thing about the US is it is really, in my view, a minority of students who've been affected this way. There are disagreements on that. There are people like Greg Lukianoff who says, no, it's at least half of the students, maybe even a majority of the students who've been affected. I'm not talking about graduates, but based on what I have seen, I think both in the US and in the UK, the student that's driven, that's curious, that wants to enhance their critical thinking, the student is there. Faculties are there, even though many of them have been silenced or are scared. There's this silent majority. And then you have the administrators who, in my view, are really the ogres in the room. And so you have to have this confrontation between the university bureaucracy on the one hand, that has its own idea about what the core business of the university is, versus the faculty and the students. And that confrontation, if it happens in the UK now, I think you can salvage these institutions. Did you say Cambridge was 800 years old? Well, we're talking about a completely different thing here, rather than these much younger institutions in the US. So it is in this confrontation between which direction, what is the purpose of a university? Is it to be a madrasa? Is it to shape and to propagandize and to turn out graduates who are dogmatic in whatever that they've been taught to believe? Or is the core business of the university teaching critical thinking? I think that's a fight that you can have and you can win.
It's so puzzling, isn't it, that in an institution and a profession where there exists this very precious professional privilege, namely academic freedom, not every, in fact, very few professions have anything like it. I suppose you could say parliamentarians have it, lawyers have it in certain specific situations, relationships with clients. Maybe priests have some sort of protection, the protection of the seal of the confessional. That's a little bit different. And so why is it, do you think, that it's in these institutions that the groupthink began and seems to have disseminated across the public square?
I think you have to go back in time to try and figure out the answer to that question, which I have come to the conclusion there have been really some subversive efforts that were going on in the West, in the whole of Western society, but in a more powerful way in America. While I was preparing for this talk, I picked up a book by Samuel Huntington. He's known for The Clash of Civilizations. But the book I picked up is a book on the American identity, and the title of the book is Who Are We? And he goes back in time to, the time in end of the 20th century, or rather towards the end of the 20th century. He says during the First World War, after the Second World War, during the Cold War, there existed a common identity, national identity of what America is and what it ought to be. And it was creedal. It was about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It was many people of different ethnicities and religions and backgrounds, but united in one. And then along came this group of people that called themselves the deconstructionists, who started to emphasize diversity and emphasize what separates us and emphasize group identities, all about the group. And I think this is these deconstructionists are the ones who probably leaned toward the left and then took over the Democratic Party. But you go back in time as far as that, and then those influences coming to Europe, and again insisting on this philosophy of multiculturalism, just as more and more immigrants are coming to Europe and settling here, immigrants with different religions and different ideas of what the good life is. And if you have no dominant culture, you have no dominant creed, you have no agreement on what the nation state is, what the institutions are about, then you get into the state in which we are now, where I think you become, number one, bureaucratic, because these institutions, if you read the story of David Butterfield, my takeaway from it was the university is going to churn out a bureaucrat, an administrator, who is going to then find a career in a government that is going to look after everyone and have these bureaucratic channels, and also in corporations. And so is that really who we are and what we want? Is that how we define the good life?
In your own life, Ayaan, you've confronted two faces of extremism. First, as you're growing up in Somalia, and then tragically again in your new life in the Netherlands, the face of Islamic extremism. And more recently, in the last 10 years, you've been a great early prophet, as it were, speaking against the rise of I don't know if it's fair to call it left wing. It doesn't bear much resemblance to the old left, but a kind of, let's call it a progressive extremism, obviously different in its outlook in many, many ways from Islamic extremism and in its practices and conduct. But nevertheless, there is this strange complicity between these two forms of extremism. It's as if they certainly, one runs cover for the other, and you have this strange marriage of rainbow and crescent that it is very puzzling to those of us who are neither part of the crescent people or the rainbow people. How can you help us understand that strange synthesis?
I think the rainbow people are in search of a deity, and the crescent people readily provides one. You can summarize it as that. The crescent people are, again, it's Islamic extremism, or what really is, it's Islamism, a political philosophy that society should be organized according to the dictates of Islam, and Sharia law should be adopted. It's the political doctrine that was adopted after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It was the response to that decline and fall. And they were the opposite of those who said, let's go for modernity, let's copy the white man and modernize. And modernization, unfortunately, did not bring to Arab and Muslim countries the prosperity and the stability and the freedoms that Europeans seemed to have. So taking over the European models of government didn't simply translate into the same outcomes. And that gave the Islamists, I think, the credentials that they keep on showing and saying, if you join the Muslim Brotherhood, your life is better off than if you join the Ba'athists or if you go down the path of modernity. And the tragic story of the Arabs who became Palestinian at some point is that their nationalism, what is being projected into this group of Arabs in that part, they are supposed one day, their pride will be realized and their sacrifices will be realized. And that realization is going to come in a nation for them. But that nation is going to be Islamic, because that's what Hamas is about. It's going to be Sharia based. And it can only come if the Jews are destroyed and if the state of Israel is destroyed. Now, the people of the rainbow are the products of Western society. They have been, what should I say, the students or maybe the victims of the deconstructionist philosophy. And the deconstruction starts from away from whatever their spiritual foundations were, and drifting off into wanting to realize or wanting to fight for justice. Because if you look at them, if you listen to them, if you look at the slogans they're holding, they're saying, we are fighting for justice, we are fighting for equality, without realizing that all of these things that they say they're fighting for, much of these things have been actually realized, without also realizing that if they went to Gaza or if they went to any part of the Arab Islamic world, that they would be jailed, they would be beaten to pulp, they would be imprisoned, they would be killed, they would be thrown from tall buildings. So it's very weird to watch graduates from places like Harvard and MIT and Penn U living in a world as connected as this one, with as much information as we have, having only seen ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, that these young people can, with all that knowledge at their fingertips, still go about the streets thinking that somehow they are immune to what their partners say,
Yes.
to what Hamas says.
That's fascinating. And yet, I suppose the shared narrative that they are both, for all of their great differences, they are nevertheless groups that belong to an oppressed class, and as it were, share some kind of strange synthetic solidarity up against a common oppressor, just defined as Western civilization or Western oppression or colonial oppression, makes it kind of coherent that a movement like Gays for Gaza, for instance, that was much derided and mocked, but in fact that's a completely coherent alliance within a worldview that sees oppressed groups as belonging together, and whatever the differences might be between those oppressed groups, nevertheless their shared hostility to the oppressor transcends those differences.
Yes, and the weird thing is that the oppression it's imagined, it's romantic, because a lot of these civil rights, they've been achieved, they've been realized. Gays here and on the other side of the Atlantic are not oppressed. They have as many rights as everyone else. Neither are Arabs or Muslims here or elsewhere. So you have to imagine this, you have to fantasize about these oppressed ideals. If you're a woman growing up in any Muslim country, you need permission from your guardian. There are things by law you cannot do. The most simple things: walk out of your door, go shopping, have a boyfriend, marry the man you want. You just simply cannot do these things. You're not allowed to. So that's not imagined oppression. When you live in Afghanistan and you're a woman, what you're going through is not imagined. It's a real struggle. When you're in Iran and you're a woman, you're not. It's the real deal. What we are watching on university campuses here and what we are seeing here is not something that these people are going. It is this play acting. It's this performative thing, and I think a lot of it is maybe there really is a desire to do something good. You're always asked, leave the world a better place, and some people respond to that. Then they are also constantly plugged into these social media and this virtual world where they really don't live in reality. And so it's really easy to disengage from reality. I think there is a desire for the struggles and the fights that their forefathers had, which gives meaning to life. But in an affluent society, there's very little to struggle for. They have smartphones, they have food, they have shelter, they have warmth, they have everything. In fact, some of the demands that they make are quite silly. When in the spring, when they were struggling and they were fighting for justice, they all had tents from Amazon, and then they were demanding particular foods. So there really isn't much of a struggle that's going on. But there is, and I think the real struggle is a spiritual struggle. There is an emptiness there that they are not getting from their own homes, from their own communities, or from their own societies. And this is a void that is looking for something to fill it, and it's getting filled by these bad actors. and bad ideas.
That takes us beautifully on to another series of questions I'd like to put to you before we open things up to the floor. You've written at least two books that I've read and have made an enormous impression on me when I read them as soon as they came out. One was Infidel, which is an extraordinary autobiography that you wrote about your upbringing in Somalia, the move to the Netherlands, and your experiences, and the tragedy that you've witnessed there, and also Heretic, in which you lay out a very moving call to arms for moderate Muslims to think about how Islam might undergo its own reformation. One would have thought with books under your belt with titles like that you would be a hardened skeptic, that you would leave both religions and ideologies well alone. And yet that's not quite what's happened in recent years. Tell us a little bit about that. And I know that a lot of people here are interested in that. And how was it the case that a kind of the sort of classical liberalism, agnostic to ideology, quietist about religion, has evolved into something slightly different?
I think the problem is you can decide to leave these things alone, but they don't leave you alone. As many of us know, and as professors in Cambridge, you probably know, you want to leave politics alone, but politics doesn't leave you alone. So in my case, I think the more I think about it, the more I think liberalism gets you only so far. It answers part of the questions of the human condition. It doesn't answer all of them. So through personal experience, my own personal experience, I have come to the conclusion that I want more. And so I have decided to become a Christian. But I've also seen all around me people in search of something, in the acknowledgement that there is something greater than ourselves. What is it? Where do I find it? Some people turn to Buddhism. Some people just simply, a lot of people here in the West are born either into a Christian home or a Jewish home, and they go back home. And for me, going back home was going back to Islam, and there's plenty of it here. But yeah, I don't find it attractive. I adopted a life. I ran away from home and then adopted a lifestyle based on principles that just needed that spiritual crowning that I found within Christianity. And for me, it's really as simple as the God of Islam is a God of fear. He wants you to do certain things and not do other things, and you'll be rewarded or punished based on that. The God of Christianity, I love John Lennox's description of saying it doesn't matter whether you do these things or you don't do those things. The relationship is one that you have, and it's a relationship based on love, and it's unconditional. And really, you can be as naughty as you want, but if you seek forgiveness and redemption, you find it. And that's a much more appealing story. It's so much easier, I find, to be a Christian than to be a Muslim.
And do you think that in the end is the best solution to the meaning crisis, the sort of vacuum, the existential vacuum that you think is driving so many young people on campus today towards ideological extremism?
I don't think you can prescribe it. I don't think you can look at someone with purple hair or the women who are now shaving their hair after an election and look at them and say, why did you just adopt Christianity? They won't do that. They'll say something about the patriarchy and shave off the rest of what's left. But what you can do, I think, is you can talk about the existence of Christianity. So one of the things I find interesting is that talk of the original faith of these societies is something that you either don't talk about, or you're too embarrassed to discuss, or it's delegated to people in Alabama and faraway places where they say these are flyover countries, and so they are what's the British English word for it, in the boonies, people in the boonies or whatever you call it. So that banishing of Christianity, so people don't even know, they don't know that they have, they have, they don't really know what they have. They don't understand it. So part of it is, I think, just bringing back the curriculum, bringing back the stories, talking about it. And I think you will then see these connections take place. Um, when I look at the Muslims converting non-Muslims to Islam, they look at the exact same people who are seeking something and say, I think you're lost. I think you're looking for something. And I have the answer. And they push a book into their hands, or they say, come to my home. And they experience a great deal of hospitality and warmth and love. And only then do conversations about God and the hereafter and all of that happen. And I think we take it for granted that that a lot of our young people will find these things or will not find these things. But what I have seen in universities from Stanford and UCLA and San Diego University, so all along the West Coast and then along the East Coast, is just a lot of students, a lot of young people who are insecure in their skins, who are very embarrassed and ashamed about their national identity, who are embarrassed and ashamed about their affluence, who are seeking something bigger than themselves, and unfortunately are finding these various groups, whether it's online or offline, and then sinking into despair through addictions, through this incredibly politicized relationship between men and women. And so it's, we had heterosexuals and homosexuals, and now you have, you can't make it up. It's just every day you have the emergence of something new sexual, this and new sexual that, which is the individualization. So you're getting to this designer bits, and it's a form of narcissism, of looking inward, navel gazing taken to such extremes. And so that's, what we're observing. Again, not everyone. Jonathan Haidt has seen, and he's not the only one, he has remarked, for instance, on the difference between young women in conservative homes and young women in liberal homes. And the despair, he seems to think, is more concentrated. There's more data pending. But it sort of is pointing towards the liberal homes. That is where really there is more despair, especially where, and it's a taboo to say this, where both parents work.
Well, that leads me on to my next question. This will be my final question before we open up. And this is just a thought that I wonder what you make of the idea that the loss of Christianity and the rising instability in that sense of one's identity at the individual level and the sense of an ordered whole, an ordered communal whole in which we exist are intertwined. You've written, I know, beautifully about your realization that in your view, when it comes to Western civilization and Christianity, you can't enjoy the fruits without the roots. And I wonder if you see this dislocation, existential dislocation among young people, and this sense of fracture across society as being bound up with the severing of those roots.
I see it with the severing of those roots, and I think it is Os Guinness really who can tell this much better than I can do it. But I think that if you, even if you just talk about, flip open any history book, or I studied political science, so any of the literature that I see now, as opposed to when I studied it in 1995, it's all about decolonizing the curriculum. It's about ethnic studies. It's about oppression. It's about people who've been exploited and enslaved and all the rest of it. And who did all of these things? You did it, the white man. And so when you look at these maps of intersectionality, you have the white male, the white heterosexual male as the oppressor. So as a young white man growing up, you can't do anything about it. That's what you learn. Christianity is the religion of the white male. It is, we are told, it's the patriarchy. It's what led to anti-Semitism. It's what led to slavery. It's what led to this, that, and the other. And so it's the story that is told about the foundations and the roots of these societies that is confusing. And to say confuse is really charitable. But it's confusing young people. It's confounding young people. And you have young people who then reject what's theirs and what's their legacy, but they are not given anything in return. What do you have in return? That you're going to become a bureaucrat within a big state, a bureaucrat within a big global company, and that is where you're going to get your meaning and your purpose of life. That's the idea.
Hi, it's Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you'd like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. The link is with the info below. Now, back to the conversation.
It's just time to open things up to you. Please speak up, put your hands up so I can see them and I don't miss anyone, and do offer a question. But before we open things up to you as a whole, I've invited Justin Brierley, and some of you here will already know Justin through his magnificent work for the program Unbelievable, and now his work pioneering a podcast, The Surprising Return of Belief in God. It's wonderful to have Justin with us, and he's kindly recording this evening's event for us, which I think is a first. So great to have you with us, Justin. Just a few thoughts and reflections and questions from you.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Ayaan. I've been following the story since really you announced your conversion about a year ago at the time of recording. And I had sort of noticed something happening that your story seemed to be an encapsulation of, because just a month or two before you wrote that viral article for Unheard, Why I Am Now a Christian, I had published a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, noting that the new atheism had sort of risen but fallen quite spectacularly as well, and that there was this new conversation going on among secular intellectuals, newly sort of aware of the influence and value of Christianity. And then your story just sort of seemed to encapsulate that in so many ways. Your own sort of intellectual conversion at one level to the fact that, yes, the West is based in this Judeo-Christian story, but also obviously the important personal dimension of this as well. I was very moved by the interview you did subsequently for Unheard about your own journey on that front. I just wondered firstly whether you sense this is something that goes beyond your own personal experience. Are you an outlier here, as you know, possibly the most famous female atheist in the world coming to faith, or are you seeing other people, other secular peers going on similar journeys?
I see other people, secular people, going on a similar journey. I think there's still a great deal of insecurity about coming out. There are a lot of coming outs that are happening. People are coming out saying, I voted for Trump. That's supposed to be revolutionary. So even an election now is a coming out. But I do see a shift towards, and I know it because after I had written that article, lots of friends wrote to me whom I didn't know were Christian. I thought they were fellow atheists, and said, my goodness, you just what you said, or you captured that, or some of them saying, and by the way, here is this book that you should read that has brought me back to the fold, or has inspired me to become a Christian again. So I think there are a lot of people who either are silently, and that we think they're agnostic or atheist when in fact they're Christian, or there's a shift towards there's something rather than nothing. I see churches filling up, mainly Catholic churches. I see in America now a very open. I mean, this last election was remarkable after the failed assassination attempt on Trump, where he actually said this is divine intervention. And a lot of people openly saying this is divine intervention, when I think maybe a few years back you couldn't you couldn't say such a thing, you would be laughed out of the room. And generally speaking, I find Americans more friendly towards religion anyway, more than in Europe. But the secularization in America was quite rapid, especially on either side of the coasts. October 7, 2023, right after that, again, I would say there was more of an openly religious, um, um, not demonstration, it wasn't out there, but references to God, references to scripture. I think there's something. Yeah,
Yes.
there's a trend.
If I could have one more question, which is hearing everything you've said about your concerns around academia and what you see as the rise of this sort of very far left progressive woke politics that you feel is sort of infecting everything and allying with other unusual bedfellows and stuff. How do you respond now, in a sense, from the point of view of being a Christian to that? Because there was obviously criticism at the time you wrote your article. Oh, this is a cultural conversion, a political thing. This is about civilizational war. I wondered actually whether you were really calling for some kind of clash, in that sense. I just wanted to hear from you really. What do you think is the answer, standing where you are now, to those issues? You've already talked about there being a spiritual issue. What are some of the practical steps, speaking as a Christian, I suppose, that we take towards speaking into the academy and those political issues that seem to manifest in our culture?
Yeah. So I wasn't calling for a clash. I was remarking on the fact that there is a clash. And I'm not the first, I will not take credit for that. I think the Clash of Civilizations, that title will forever, Samuel Huntington, and before him, by the way, Bernard Lewis. But in this clash, which it's just there for all to see, my recommendation is it's not so much a military clash as a clash of ideas. And instead of subduing and suppressing the radical ideas on which the West is founded, that are not just radical, they were radical back in the day, but are also really superior. These are the ideas we ought to be talking about and we ought to be passing on to younger generations. In fact, the failure to pass it on to younger generations is criminal, in my view, because you're leaving them empty-handed. And it's their legacy as much as, I didn't fight for women's rights in Europe. I only profited, I benefited from that. And then I understand as part of my duty to pass it on is then at least to pass on the knowledge, the foundations of where these rights and freedoms come from, these things that made the West superior. And a major part of that is Christianity. It's the Christian story. And that, I think, is something we ought to do. We ought to pass it on. And we ought to insist on. You can choose whether you want to believe in God or not. But you can take up, you should become aware of the fact that the Gospels exist. You should become aware of the fact that there is a church of the history of England, So, yeah.
Thank you, Justin, very much indeed. Yes, one of the things that struck me from the article by Professor Butterfield that Ayaan just referred to is that I think he stressed that it's our role as in the academy, as both as students and staff, not only to be pursuing the truth, but to be preserving the truth where we find it and to be passing it on too. And so it's not just that it's not just research, but teaching is also part of the kind of sacred professional duty of
And defending it. Yeah, so when you're attacked, you defend it. And these attacks now, they're much more major. But I remember early on, I've talked about this a few times, when they say, can you remove the cross because somebody is going to get cross? And you should say, no, explain it. there were all these fights about Christmas lights, and so if you have Christmas, then we have Diwali and we have Eid, and so you can have Eid and you can have Diwali, but this is what Christmas means and where it comes from. And here's why we're hanging on to it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Gentleman in the blue jacket, thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Can you hear me? Well, yeah, good. So maybe this is the wrong audience to ask it, but back to your opening remarks, do you think there's an issue here in Britain of an Americanization of education? So you go to any master's program here and you'll find most of the cohort will be from America because of funding or other issues like that. And often they bring their cultural issues and try and lead the student bodies here. And so with the Gaza issue, for example, they were led mostly by Americans. Is that an issue you find that's, here?
Are we becoming the 51st state when it comes to the university sector?
And other sectors too.
Yeah, a vassal state.
Yeah. So the terrible ideas were first incubated here in Europe in French universities. All these postmodernists, the Derrida and Foucault, and those guys were all the Frankfurter School. They were Germans. So these are ideas that came from Europe, and I think Europe rejected them. Found a home in America, incubated in American universities, grew there, became pretty much commercialized to a certain degree, and that are now coming back at you, and driven by this international global phenomenon of diversity. And so, yes, it is coming at you. Are we in danger of becoming the 51st state, is your question. I think it's already happening. I mean, I can read in your newspapers about children in schools here being taught about white privilege. I mean, this is Britain. What does white privilege mean? You're all white. Then I know you do have minorities.
At least until very recent, certainly post-war, I think there were maybe 40 to 50,000 people of color in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think what I see happening with this is the first layer that comes, it's exactly as it is. The language that's used at Harvard and Stanford is the language that comes to be used here. People start to look puzzled and think, what are they talking about? And then they leave the racial side out of it, and then it becomes colonialism. So here the insistence on the colonial past, whereas in America it's all about race, this and gender. But that's you are exactly right, and it comes through movies, it comes through storytelling, it comes through music, and then it comes through the bureaucratization of the university. The one thing that's really fortunate in the UK is you don't have as much money as as you have in the US. So the corruption is much slower.
Couldn't agree more. It's one of our great virtues here in Oxford and Cambridge. We're so poor that the leadership is much, much more sensitive to legal liability and legal risk, whereas Harvard is really a hedge fund with a university attached. Lady at the back there, sorry, I can't see you yet.
Thanks for the inspiring conversation. And just wanted to ask, I think James Orr was going to ask it, but what are your thoughts about what just happened in Amsterdam after the game?
Thank you. Yes, so reflections, Ayaan, on last week's horrors in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam is in doom loop, just like I think the UK probably is also in its own form of doom loop. And here's the loop. You have a number of immigrant Muslim mainly young men. So it's not all Muslims, but a cluster of them. They are completely radicalized either as Islamists or by gangs. They are shut out, or in my view, they've shut themselves out of the wider society. There's an infrastructure in the Netherlands that's been permitted, and it's been going on for the last 25 years at least that I'm aware of mosques and Islamic centers and now online, where these young men, their idea of what it is to live in society is completely warped by the Muslim Brotherhood. That erupts into violence. So what happened in Amsterdam is specifically against Jews. It's a pogrom. It's exactly what they hear in the mosque and in the Islamic center, that Jews are cursed because they bring corruption and so on to the land, that it says in the Quran and in the Hadith, wherever you find them, kill them. Then they get all the propaganda from the Middle East. Just to give you an idea, the Muslims that I talk about in Holland are not from Palestine. They're not from the Middle East. They're from North Africa. They're either from Morocco or from Turkey. And they are not first generation. They are second or third generation. So they have no proximity whatsoever with the conflict that's going on in Gaza. But it's what they hear in the mosque. They act on it. The academics, the political leaders, the mayor of Amsterdam, they all sit together and they shake their heads. They say, what a shame. That was a pogrom. How awful. We apologize to the victims. We feel deeply ashamed about how we've let down the Jews one more time. Nothing is going to happen. Why is nothing going to happen? Because of the demographics. I haven't seen any serious attempt by the Dutch to dismantle this infrastructure that rots, that Hamasifies the hearts and minds of these young people. I haven't seen it at all. I've seen Geert Wilders, who's elected to be prime minister, but who's not prime minister because they won't let him, suggest things that might bring about consequences, but it's not going to happen. And I've seen the exact same thing in the UK, in France, in Germany, a condemnation of the terrorist attack or the riots or whatever, what have you. But the infrastructure of Hamasification continues to grow day by day. And demographically speaking, these constituencies that go to these infrastructures, they will grow through immigration, through their birth rates, and through these parallel societies. And that's what I mean by the doom loop. It's going to keep expanding. That's really the real challenge for Europe. Yeah.
Thank you. Is that Matthew, I think, in the middle here? Oh, sorry. Is it you got somebody else in mind, Justin? Yep, fine. Leave it to you.
Ayaan, thank you. Hopefully I speak on behalf of everybody that we're grateful you've come here to dialogue with us. In terms of women's rights, you've critiqued Islamist perspectives on femininity, and I'm just curious to hear what you find compelling about the Christian view of biblical womanhood.
Yes, I suppose a difference is a sort of very particular understanding of women in Islam, at least traditionally, and there's a more emancipatory conception of what it is to be a woman on hyper-progressivism, where equality means sameness. So to be a woman is to effectively do everything that a man does. Do you think Christianity offers a third way?
I think what I find in Christianity is the acknowledgement of the woman as a human being, equal in the eyes of God, just equal to a man. And God's love for the female human is just as strong as God's love for the male human. And based on that, I think you can then develop a narrative throughout, and that has happened, I think, over the centuries, to say, well, then men and women should be equal before the law. But more fundamentally, I think what it means is a recognition of the agency of women as a human individual. What Islam does is it says explicitly a woman has no agency. She's her guardian, first her father, then her husband, and so on and so forth. And then there's a role that's prescribed for her, and she has to stay within that role and submit to it. So when you then take the old scripture, Islamic scripture, and you develop the narrative, what you get is Sharia law. These are two different views of what a woman's place in society is. Now, what has happened in Western societies and what I see now as this incredibly toxic strain of feminism is somehow, first there was the recognition of women's agency. Women have the right to vote. They have the right to hold a job. They have the right to have autonomy over their bodies and over their lives, just like an adult male. It has now morphed into something else where with a particular strain of feminism, I am seeing the agency of women taken away and given to the state and or given back to men. If I have a relationship with a man and we have a falling out, I can be very disappointed. But I can't come to you and say, in hindsight, I really didn't volunteer. That is a surrender of women's agency back to the man. This is by invoking your, weaker sex or womanness, you're giving back your agency. And then the other one is adopting the state or a relationship with the state, which leads, I think, to a state of misery for many women. Now, in modern day life as a woman, and I'm going through this myself, it's really hard to balance being a mother, being a wife, with having a career. And this is something, again, that we have to resolve family by family, individual by individual. It's not something that the state is going to do for us. No matter how many laws they pass, no matter how many resources are allocated, you're going to give up freedom in exchange for that. So these are some of the conversations we have to have. But one of the things that I think young people now should be exposing really is this narrative that men and women should be hostile to one another and that it's a zero-sum game. What he has, I must have, or else. That kind of thing is leading, and you can see the crisis now. I don't know if you're following what's going on in the US, but there's a lot of insanity that has become a product of this angry, hostile, narcissistic, histrionic femininity.
Thank you. Yes, I was struck by one data point coming out of the US election results last week, where I think the gap between married and unmarried women, Trump, Harris, was roughly the same as the gap between men and women.
Yeah.
So there's some very interesting things happening in the relations between the sexes, at least as we could, at least on the political map. Yes, who's next? We've got a gentleman in the middle over there. Oh, yep, fine. Yes, good.
Oh, thank you. Going from Islam to Christianity, according to a lot of people's view, is just from one faith to another. But there are people who are very influential in this country, people like Richard Dawkins, and they categorically denounce all religions because they believe that the scriptures contradict science. And they're promoting a more enlightened world in which there's no personal God or whatsoever. So what is your personal opinion if you have to confront these people? Or you don't tell them or talk to people like Dawkins?
I have talked to Richard, and he has actually said, Ayaan, you are more intelligent than that, surely. And I think Richard is wrong. I think Richard's assumption, like Bertrand Russell's assumption, was that if you no longer believe in God, or, faith disappears, that human beings are just going to be filled with reason and enlightenment. And that's not the case. And I think the mistake he makes is to create a false dichotomy that it's either faith or reason, whereas it is in fact both. It's just the way you separate politics from religion. You separate all of these realms. You use different methods of knowing and understanding, but you can have it all, and it's much more enriching than squeezing yourself into one narrow lane.
Thank you. Thank you. No, don't worry. Have a sip of water. And I suppose even somebody like Dawkins is going to have certain pre-rational postures towards the world that are not themselves going to be justified by this canons and norms of empirical science.
But it's also a faith in its own right. If you refuse to look at and you say, this is, I believe that there is no God. It's just as much, it's a declaration of faith in itself. Yeah.
Yes, gentleman in the middle, and then we'll come down towards the front row.
Yeah, thank you very much. Quite enjoying the dialogue. I guess my question get back to the idea about the Ivy League or the top institute being captured by this type of thinking. What deeply puzzles me is not the political stance they take. It's the sheer lack of capacity of thinking that I find just strange. And by thinking, I'm not thinking about something as grandiose as Kantian thought of enlightenment. It's the sheer capacity to reason. Because you remark about this mental gymnastic that links queer interest to Palestinian. It's just like, how do you get that into your head? And also, it's just all the intersectional stuff. You just read about it. They just basically don't make the basic sense. So if that's the case, I'm still wondering, because I can't reconcile to myself why institutions like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Cambridge, Oxford, well, if you can assume something that's very basic of those institutions, it should be those people are basically intelligent, right? So I do have this question: why do you think we have this remarkable lack of capacity for thinking?
So I think what you're describing gets to the core of the question of what is the university precisely for. And there was this assumption, I think, and consensus that it was for critical thinking. And when students come, they are presented with a lot of texts that they learn to grapple with, that they read through, that they then are questioned over and write essays on, and learn to hold an idea, to defend that idea, look at it from different perspectives, that whole exercise. Not every student can do that. So when you come from high school, the university was supposed to select for students that could do that, the selection criteria. That's where it started. It started to be challenged. The whole admissions process became, in my view, contaminated with the words diversity. And so it wasn't selecting for who's prepared to go through that exercise. It was now who's Black, who comes from this or that background, and female, and you name it. And then from there, and it sounded good. It was the African Americans in America were left behind. Most universities were white. So it was a noble idea to say, let's bring them in. I think what we are learning now is, for some people, they really were seeking some level of social justice when they wanted to diversify the university through the admissions process. But many others had an agenda. And the agenda was to change the core business of the university. Not to graduate critical thinkers, but to graduate dogmatic bureaucrats. And that's a fight we're going to have. That's a fight we're having now. And I think the UK is lucky because you now know what's going on the other side of the Atlantic. It's easy to destroy an institution. It's very hard to build an institution. So you need very urgently to really stand up and look at what's going on within your institution and fight the bureaucrats who are trying to shift that, to change what the university really is about. And it's a great fight to have. If you wanted a struggle, there is your struggle.
Well, thank you, Ayaan. And that's what events like this are all about. And that's why we're so grateful to you for sharing and help leading us through this struggle. Yes, thank you. Michael at the front here.
Thank you very much for fascinating comments. You mentioned this concept of a doom loop here in Western Europe. Do you have ideas about policy prescriptions that could break out of that doom loop? And do you believe that those policy prescriptions are feasible?
I think you need a paradigm shift before you get into any kind of policy prescription, which is, what is this society? Who is it for? And if we carry on the way we are, if we carry on this path, is it sustainable? So you have really the choice of the circumstances deciding for you, or you deciding before the circumstances come and hijack you. And that is, I think, what the election just now in the US was all about. Was you had these different parts where people felt the country was really falling apart. Something had to happen. And we have a mandate now in the US. And I think if that mandate is not enacted, in 2028, we are going to be in an even worse place. And what I have seen in Europe, and the reason why I call it a doom loop, is you have elections with no consequences. You've had Brexit, it has meant nothing. They've had an election in November of 2023 in the Netherlands, nothing happened. And in France, and so the electorate keeps telling you what they want: close the bloody borders. You bring in more people. At one point, circumstances are going to decide for you.
Yeah, same's happening in Germany and elsewhere. It's absolutely right. A kind of deep disconnect between ruler and ruled.
The surprising rebirth of belief in God has been making waves since its launch. Now you can listen to all of Season 1. Discover the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Featuring interviews with leading thinkers across the faith spectrum, you'll learn the inside account of the rise and fall of new atheism. All 30 episodes of Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God are available now. Find out why we've become a #1 ranked religion and spirituality podcast when you jump in at episode 1. Go to justinbrierley.com/surprisingrebirth to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. That's justinbrierley.com.
Peter, just right here, Justin.
Thank you for your comments, Ayaan. I've followed your career through reading your books and listening to your appearances on current affairs programs and videos and the like over the years. And since I'm unexpectedly in the same room with you, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for your incredibly brave witness towards much that's best in the West, and also speaking out so clearly about the dangers of Islam. I think you represent two qualities that are desperately needed, namely courage and rationality. My question is about the use of the term Islamism, which seems to me to be gaining a kind of widespread acceptance. I hear it more and more. And personally, I'm deeply suspicious of it. I think it's a little addition to the word Islam to kind of soften the blow, to put a distance linguistically between the fact that the problem we're talking about a lot of the time is actually Islam. It's not some bit of Islam. And that the Islamists, in their thinking and in their working out of the texts of Islam, are the consistent ones. They are the Muslims. And what the Quran would call the hypocrites are the moderate Muslims, the ones who don't take it literally, don't take it seriously, don't go the whole way. So it's a way, when I listen to you, I always say, but she's using the term Islamism. And Majid Nawaz and several other very sensible commentators use it. And I'd just like to hear you say why you think it's a valid term.
Well, so from an academic perspective, when you say what exactly is Islamism, you are going to conclude it's the most serious form of Islam, meaning it is Islam derived from the Quran, the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Seerah, which is the example of the Prophet, and the application of Sharia law. That's what we've been calling Islamism. So Islamism is Islam at its most pure form, in its most pure form. And you're absolutely right. Most Muslims who do not abide by Islam in its most pure form are regarded, for instance, by the Muslim Brotherhood, by Hizb ut-Tahrir, by those who abide by Islam, and they're regarded as lost, as wrong, as hypocrites, as traitors, as heretics. And even real takfir, which is as unbelievers, and some of them are, in fact, many of them are killed. And the statement, more Muslims have been killed by the extremists than non-Muslims, is true because of that. And more Muslims are oppressed by those who 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 want to follow in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. Why do I use Islamism? Because when I first started in, what was it, 2001, 9/11, 2001, um, I was debating and speaking in a climate where I was constantly told there's a small minority of Muslims, the people from Morocco and Turkey and other Muslim majority countries in the Netherlands, they feel alienated. And we as a majority, we have to, on the one hand, make them feel welcome and at home, while on the other hand, criticizing the basic tenets of their faith. So the first introduction when I joined politics actually was not even to use the word Islam. It was the days of the euphemisms of violent extremism. So that's what we would be discussing, violent extremism, and all sorts of names and labels that didn't make sense at all and that didn't take us to the core of the problem. But I do it mainly to signal to Muslim audiences, I'm not criticizing you. It's about these basic, most pure and political forms of Islam. And so I'm happy to call it Islamism if it makes it, if it's practical to have the conversation. And what can I say? I think that I've made some traction with some people. Incredibly, it's the people who are in the Middle East, people from the UAE, Saudis, Iraqis, Jordanians, who actually do want to talk about, to have the conversation just as you're having it. But it's the immigrant Muslims who say, no, I can't, you can't, it's, Islam is peace. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm.
Sam over here, Sam Bickerstaff, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is really the other side of the coin to that last question. You talked about the practicality of distinguishing between Islam and Islamism. I wondered, in reflecting on what the future of Islam might be in general, what you might see the place being for particularly Sufi forms of Islam. Because we talk about very often in Western discourse a certain violence that seems to be quite primordial in Islam, whether in the Quran itself or in the history of the Prophet and the history that followed. But within Sufi authors, such as Ibn Arabi or Ibn Sabain, you get an overwhelming emphasis on love. And love seems to be the absolute centerpiece of that philosophy. And so I wonder whether, as you've already distinguished between different kinds of attitudes within the Islamic world, whether in diaspora or in the Middle East, there might be a way forward that you think you would quite like to see for the religion in returning to certain Sufi roots and moving away from the more hostile or more originally violent forms of Islam. Right.
So in the past, it used to be the caliph, the central authority, who would have the discretion to either loosen the leash or, decide how pure the constituency was going to be or not, and had a relationship with the ulama, the clergymen, who may have wanted to apply Islam as its purest, in its purest form. In modern day, 21st century Muslim world, we don't have a caliph, but we do have the custodian of Mecca and Medina, of the mosques, the holy sites of Islam. And the Saudis have in the past convened and chaired and brought together the large Sunni nations, which is a majority of Muslims. And they have embarked through resolutions in these conventions on certain policy measures. I think it's perfectly possible today for Mohammed bin Salman to convene the leaders of the Muslim world. I think Trump, in his first term, got them to agree to the Abraham Accords to somehow recognize Israel and embark maybe on the possibility of having a relationship with them, trade and security, which really made the ulama, the clergymen, livid. And so it is possible for these political leaders to go around the ulama and to decide what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. The government of the UAE has overhauled its school curriculum from nursery school all the way to universities and somehow managed to keep the ulama out. Mohammed bin Salman, the future king of Saudi Arabia, he wants to diversify his economy and make it part of the global order. And he has embarked on it and has already defied the ulama. So I think, practically speaking, it is possible for them to convene together and to say there are parts of the Quran and the Hadith and the Seerah that we are going to declare obsolete. And that from now onwards, this is what's taught to children. And this is how we define Islam. That's perfectly possible.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And that would usher in the Reformation that you were arguing for in Heretic.
Yeah. But it has to be enforced.
Yes.
And so you see, but again, I just want to remark on the difference between Islam and Christianity in that sense. For Islam to be truly a religion of peace, it has to be enforced by the ruler with force. For him to define what peace is and enforce it with the hard hand. And with Christianity to be, and that was again the Reformation, for it to be truly a religion of peace, you have to go back to the basic gospels and the doctrines. Last night I was reading to my son, just as Jesus is being crucified, and he says, he prays to God and prays for the Pharisees, and says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." My Somali blood was boiling, and I was thinking, these terrible people. And there he was saying, "Forgive them." So this is, again, really, it's very important to distinguish that there is a difference between the two religions here.
Thank you. We've got one there, Justin, and then a couple more at the front. Yes, lady there. Hello.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayaan, for your... Thank you very much for your very brilliant talk. We miss you a lot in Holland, I can say. And your voice really is lost, and there's nobody who has taken it. So I'm very happy to be here tonight and to tell my home what you told tonight. I was thinking about what you said about the role of women in culture, and there's this saying that you can know a culture by how they treat their women. And we are really, really very worried about what's happening to women in Afghanistan and Iran and Libya nowadays. But at the same time, there is a strange erasure of women in the West. And then I mean in the language, in the sports, and even in their rooms. I think there's a strange similarity there, but I haven't found out yet what it is. Maybe can you tell something about that?
I think you're talking about the transgender activism, which has to be, again, it really seen as distinct from people with gender dysphoria. So there are individuals who are struggling with gender dysphoria, and unfortunately their pain is taken and it's converted into a political movement, and part of it is then applied as a tool to challenge women's identity, women's spaces. And this is, J.K. Rowling is here, I think, our heroine who fights it, and Helen Joyce. And I think there's been a much stronger intellectual fight back against this thing. Abigail Shrier is in America. I'll say, fortunately, the backlash against this is swift. So I'm hopeful about it. But a lot of young people, especially children, have been subjected to the most heinous sorts of surgeries, and it's irreversible. There's just so much to say, and it's all really very, very upsetting. But part of it is this, it's this drifting away from core morality, what you can and can't do to the human body. Um, the debates that we're having in America on abortion touch on that, on what's sacred and what's not, human dignity, the human body. I want to come back to feminism, this particular strain of feminism, which we have to find a word for, which also uh, I don't say it invented the transgender activism, but it has become a part of that narrative. People who know this will say it is part of this twisted communist agenda. When the communists failed by arguing that their economic principles were superior, and in 1989 all of that dissolved, what emerged is a renewal of the story and the romanticism of communism, but now on a cultural level. And the transgender movement is part of it, the rainbow, the instrumentalization of women as a force to advance their agenda, and all of this intersectional nonsense. And I think it is, how do we see it? I think women have to stand up to it. Yeah. Do you remember the judge who was asked to define a woman in America? I mean, it's happening in 2023, 2024.
What was striking is that she answered that by saying, "I'm not a biologist," therefore implicitly conceding that it was a biological question. Peter at the front.
Thank you very much indeed. I want to return to the theme of terminology and this phrase, Islamic extremism. Some people would say radical Islam. And I wonder if there's a danger with a phrase like that it actually hands a compliment to those who might embrace that, because it makes it sound like the most authentic Islam is actually this. And even comments tonight may have suggested that. And it seems to me that whether or not that's the case, based on the Quran, Hadith, and so on, shouldn't be the business of non-Muslims or those who are speaking politically. And it's really important for us to speak politically. So the questions are, does a particular form of a religion support terrorism? Does it support revolution? And so on. And so I guess my question is it possible for us, when we speak of Islam in political contexts, to make sure that any qualification we give is a political one and not a theological one? So we're asking politicians to stay strictly to the question of, is this a particular ideology which is claiming to be above the law of the land or not? How they get there theologically shouldn't really matter for the politician. Any response on that?
For the politician, yeah. But what about for the academic? And what about, I was embroiled in discussions. This was back when Obama was president, 2008, 2009. They had within the national security segment in Homeland Security, a group of agents who were trained, and they weren't just trained in how to prevent an attack that was being plotted. They were trained and really fluent in the Quran and in the Hadith, in the reliance of the traveler, in all the other writings of Sayyid Qutb and many of the Islamist thinkers. And that was part of understanding and analyzing the threat. And so under those, Obama abolished it using the same argument, with people saying, oh, it's Islamophobic for these people who are within the government to hold theological knowledge or theological argument. But and I think it's a loss. I think it's terrible. But under those circumstances, what would you say then? Do you say less knowledge or more knowledge? I think if you're having a polite conversation with a Muslim, small talk, I would say please avoid talking about that. If we are studying the roots of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that's almost 100 years old, and say, who are they? What are their objectives? I think it becomes hard, difficult, impossible not to talk about that. Just if you ask me, what is woke? What are the origins of woke? Sooner or later, we will start talking about some of the basics of communism, but we'll talk about postmodernism. We'll have to, understand the ideas, the ideology, the context, the environment. So it's really, let me reassure you by doing this. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Bahrainis do not avoid the subjects. They talk about it explicitly. And so they know the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in those countries, and other Islamists that are insurrectionists and that want to overthrow the system. And the only way for them to know, for those countries to know who is politically motivated and who's not, is for them to really understand the verses of the Quran that they select and the references they make to the various thinkers, and these are big thinkers of Islam. So, yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Hi, Ayaan. So good to see you. Thank you for opening this conversation up. It's been really lovely. I guess what I've been thinking about tonight is that essentially for people who want to preserve Western society, it would be advantageous to break up the unholy alliance of the rainbow and the crescent. But I think I'm shocked that that hasn't happened yet. As people have mentioned, the backsliding of women's rights in Iran and Afghanistan, you would think that that would be a big wake-up call for the woke left. And so I'm wondering if you think there's something kind of deeper than just the left kind of being in search of some sort of spiritual meaning that they might be finding in this collusion with Islamism. Do you think maybe our messaging has been off? Maybe our conflation of, the different types of, extreme Islam versus, blasé, not so threatening Islam. Do you think that gives people easy license to dismiss warnings of essentially anti-woman and gender apartheid? Or do you think that there's something even deeper than that, like a mutual hatred of Christian culture, Western culture, that's shared by extreme Islamists and the woke left?
So I think it's more of the last one, where there is the revolutionary social justice warriors who have their roots in postmodernist theories and in various flavors of Marxism. And in their outlook, they're revolutionary. I think there was someone who was caught on camera, who didn't know that he was caught on camera, who works in the Biden administration, and who was, it was about 90 days ago when Kamala Harris was being coronated, and who came out and said explicitly, when critical race theory, he said, is not being nice, it's tearing down the structures. You guys don't understand it. We want to tear down the structures. So if you have that revolutionary sentiment, that's the hardcore of them. I don't know if the pink-haired students, I don't know if they really want to go that far. But this is the hardcore of the ideology. And then you have the crescent, which is also, we've got to tear down these structures and replace it with Sharia law. I'll say the crescent and the rainbow are going together. They're on their way. They agree on this destruction and bringing down of structures. But then what happens after that? How are they going to treat one another? And so there we have a little bit of history. In Iran in 1979, there was a far left Iranians who wanted to bring down the Shah and wanted to tear everything down. And they worked harmoniously with the Islamists led by led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Now I'll become self-conscious every time I say Islamist. And Khomeini and his people, when they won and they assumed the power, they killed, they exiled, they imprisoned, and they suppressed the rainbow. That was the end of their story. We've also got, and again, it's in the Middle East, the Baathists, who are hardcore, who once every so often would decide that they were going to use the Muslim Brothers for their political ends. And then they would be welcomed and the Muslim Brothers would grow. And Syria is one example there, where when they became big enough and dangerous enough to overthrow the government, the dictator of the day, he massacred them. He killed about 20,000 or 10,000, it's a very large number, were killed in one day. So this goes back and forth. And I would say, given the history that we know, we don't want any of these two revolutionary movements to develop enough to A, destroy our structures, and B, and which is really, for me, the more important matter, is for them to capture the hearts and the minds of the youth, which they have done to a great extent here.
Well, Ayaan, thank you so much. It's been a riveting conversation and discussion, and I was just reminded as Ayaan was talking about the universities that universities themselves can't engage in free speech. They can't do free speech. It's really the people within the university that must answer that call, must engage in free and fearless inquiry, must test, receive wisdom. And so I just want to thank you all for turning up and to helping us do that and to model what free inquiry looks like and to broach provocative subjects. But of course, the biggest thanks of all are due to our speaker, who is just the embodiment of fearlessness and provocation. It has been wonderful to have you with us, Ayaan. Thank you so much for coming here.
I really hope you enjoyed that event. Thanks to Trinity Forum Europe in Cambridge for permission to film and publish it. You can find links to them from today's show. Do you want more on Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story? Well, you can find my full conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield and Glenn Scrivener discussing the response to Ayaan's conversion next. And you can visit the link below for signed copies of my books, a free chapter with the newsletter, and to support my work. In fact, supporters can get free signed copies of both my books, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. Again, the link is below. Thanks for watching.